Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Wine from On the Vine to the Road and Tasted. My name is Brian, and sitting to my right is...
Hi, Jasmine.
Jasmine. I need to stop doing that.
Why?
I need to start doing it like a recorder for...
Oh, sorry, I was distracted by something.
Yeah, so this week is about a Washington wine.
I think we've only had a couple of wines from Washington. This is like our third one, maybe, that we're
we had
talking
one
about.
from Walla Walla. Yeah,
So much history in Washington.
There is.
So many things to cover in the wine.
Yeah, it was
Wine
hard.
history.
Yeah, I kept going down rabbit holes. Every time I'd start to do some research, you'd find something interesting about Washington. You get on that thing for half an hour, and then it's hard to stay on track. So there's so many things I want to cover. I think there's a couple people we're going to talk about on the podcast this week that I'd really like to go in depth in later.
Well, maybe we can do a second one to this one, just talking about the people behind it.
Yeah. That'd be fun. So again, this is from Washington. This is what, Columbia Valley?
The Columbia Valley.
Yeah, the Columbia Valley.
AVA.
Yeah, and you tell me some facts about the Columbia Valley AVA. You were saying it's like 90% of the Washington vineyards are in the Columbia Valley, right? Or something like that?
Yes, because it's a huge territory or land, and within the Columbia Valley AVA are many sub-AVA regions, so it's a lot of land to cover, so with good reason there's a lot of regions within. So Yakima Valley is like one of them, just an example. But there's many others I'll cover later.
I think it's like 11.
There's 13. There's 13 total AVAs, and there's 11, I think, sub-regions, sub-AVAs.
Yeah, I think I read 11 million acres or something along those lines, and then
It's pretty vast.
yeah, it's big. It's really big. So yeah, this is our wine for this week is called the Pundit, and it's created by Tenant Wines, who is a subsidiary or is like a sister company of Chateau Saint Michel. So I'd like to go, before we talk about the wine, I want to go into the history of Chateau Saint Michel. For one, it's the oldest vineyard in Washington. The vineyard, the land that the vineyard is on, was owned by an old lumber baron from 1912. Their first vintage, which was in 1967, and the person who helped them create this wine was a gentleman named Andrei Chelistchev, is his name. He's Russian. He was born in 1902, I believe, and he came to California in 1936, out to Napa Valley. And he's pretty much one of the main people who put United States on the map, because he was involved with Stag's Leap. He consulted for Warren Winiarski, who was involved in the Stag's Leap. I could do a whole podcast on this guy. Andrei Chelistchev is his name. And so that was in 1967, first vintage. In 1972, they expanded to Cold Creek Vineyards. And then they expanded again in 1976. They built a French-style winery in Woodinville. And then at the same time, they changed their name from, what was her original name? Saint Michel Vintners was her name. And then they changed her name to Chateau Saint Michel in 1976. In 1991, they expanded to Canoe Ridge Estate. And then at the same time in 1991, they built a vineyard in Napa. And I think that's called Conn Creek.
Yeah, Conn Creek, C-O-N-N Creek.
Yeah, C-O-N-N Creek, yeah. So, yeah, they built out there. So, they have a huge history. Again, 1967. I know it's not old compared to the, what are the French or the Europeans, but as far as California and Oregon and Washington, 1967 is pretty old, and that's that. Is there anything you want to bring up about the winery or Chateau Saint Michel before we move on to?
Well, you had mentioned the fact that it was highly rated when we were going over this earlier, and the wine is critically acclaimed. It has 3 ratings that we found. One was by James Suckling. The second one we found was by Jeb Dunnick, and then there was another one.
A wine enthusiast.
So those were all rated in the low 90s, 91, 93, and
in 90. Yeah,
90.
Wine enthusiast was 90.
Mm-hmm.
Jeb Dunnick is 91, and I keep on thinking I'm going to say his name wrong. James Suckling is 93. 2016, 17, and 18 that I saw are all in the 90s.
Highly rated for this wine.
Yes. Yeah, for this exact wine. And and what's really neat about this wine too is it's usually right around $20. Depending. They have I think 5 varieties of this wine. And some of them go up to $40 and $50. Some of them are a little bit lower, but they're all highly rated.
Their winery is called Tennant Winery.
Yes.
The Pundit.
Yeah.
And it was originally a project, as you brought out. You mentioned the basis for this was a project between Chateau Saint Michel, Bob Berthau, and then Michel Gassier from Rhone, a critically acclaimed winemaker. But the project or their goal was to liken the way the grapes originated, Syrah, Grenache, and Vaudreuil, how they originate from the Rhone Valley, and how the terroir is similar to the AVA of Columbia Valley, because they have cooler, long, dry winters and very hot summers, and so the grapes grow similarly to the terroir that is likened to the Rhone Valley. So that was the project, is to bring that together, because they say that the Washington State is like the brethren of Rhone Valley. So that's what this Tennant Winery was based on. So that's a key factor to what they were working on, and I think they were very successful because they've made such a complex wine. It's straightforward. It's like a straight line wine, but it has complexity. You were talking earlier about the fact that it has thickness or density. So the viscosity is very heavy. It's got that heaviness when it sits on the palate. So you're tasting like the abundance of fruit. It goes into herb factors, herbaceous tones. So like spices, but like spices are ground up. If you think of taking like whole spices and grinding them up in a grinder, and you get that denser spice and the smell of the aromatics, how they change from the whole pod to like a ground spice. It changes, the aromatics open up, they become more intense. And that's what you get out of these wines that are grown in Columbia Valley. And this particular one, the Pundit, you're getting that intense flavor. It goes into earthy factors. You were talking to me about, you were going to bring something out about the earthy factor, the tobacco notes, the spices.
Yeah,
I likened it to something.
Yeah, the aroma was like a blackberry, and then a tobacco notes, and then a dark earthy notes. And I remember I was on a project, and this guy ordered this soil from. It's an old Amazonian soil. That sounds weird, but it was called a terra preta, was the name of the soil. And what it is a mixture of so the Amazonians, they had infertile soil. So in order to fix that, they would take their old clay pots, bones from the fish that they ate, and then any leftover stuff from anything that they've eaten, and they just threw it in the soil. And then also any compost, any leaf litter, and they spread this out. And this is like 600, before the Common Era, BCE. So yeah, this is like almost 3,000 years ago, 2,600 years ago, and now the soil is so fertile.
Wow.
It's incredibly fertile because they did that. So, but when we use that soil on the project, when I smelled this, I smelled that. I smelled that soil, very dark, and when you put your hands in it, it was almost like a charcoal almost, but you put your hands
Super
in it.
dense.
Yeah, and a charcoal holds on to the nutrients, and it holds on to things, and that's why it's so good. That's why I use it for filters, because it holds on to saves them and won't let it go unless it reaches a specific pH. So
Some of my favorite toothpastes are made out of charcoal.
Yeah.
Like I have this toothpaste that I love. It's black because it's made out of charcoal. It talks about the cleaning elements and the nutrients that deposit, but also how it lifts all the basically the things that layer up on your gums and your teeth. It's like that antioxidant or detoxification factor naturally that comes from charcoal, and then some mouthwashes. So. Yeah, I totally get that. You also were telling me about the blends. The blend, this is actually a blend. So
Yes,
even though it's
it
mostly
is.
Syrah, because it is driven from the Rhone Valley terroir in this collaboration of the two winemakers. You were bringing out the percentages. You want to tell us what the percentages are?
Yeah, before I go into that, so the collaboration was with Michel Gassier of Domaine Gassier. His family heritage is a Costière, a deem, and a Camargue is where he works out of. That's where his two wineries are at. That is in the Rhone. Yeah, in the southern Rhone area.
Rhone.
Yeah, and he works from 4 generations of winemakers, so he's fourth generation, which is really impressive. And then the other collaborator, his name was Philippe Cambé, and he's an enologist, and he's a consultant for the Rhone Valley. He's been consulting in the Rhone Valley since I think it was like 1986, and then he's also on the advisory council for the SCAS, which is the laboratory of the Federation of Wines for Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So he's a biggie, but he's mostly consultation. Him and Michel Gassier, they collaborated on something else too, called the Halos of Jupiter, or in French it's Les Halos de Jupiter. They made 9 different wines. They're all Rhone based, and they all are based on Grenache. So this gentleman, Philippe Cambé, he loves Grenache. He calls it the king of all grapes. And that's why he called it the Halos of Jupiter, because if you say a Jupiter in Greek, it means Zeus. So it's pretty much, a god of the gods and father of the gods and all that stuff. So he loves Grenache. So when they collaborated with him, when Chateau...
Saint Michel.
Yeah, Saint Michel. I keep forgetting that name. Gosh darn it. When Chateau Saint Michel collaborated with him, of course, they're going to involve a Grenache in this. So it's 90% Syrah, 4% a Grenache, 4% a Mourvedre, and 2% a Viognier.
Viognier is a white varietal that's added at the finish of the 3 reds that are traditional from Rhone. So it's interesting because I notice winemakers who have Syrah as like the main grape of the blend, so the predominant grape factor of the blend. They add the 1% Viognier. It gives it that refined touch that concludes the taste that they're looking for. So the finish is very satiny, very silky, and the Viognier adds that little plush tone. And it's because of the acidity, the differences in acidity and sugars from the reds to the white Viognier. Syrah is going to be your biggest flavor, like the outline or the backbone. Grenache is going to add a little bit of a brightness, a softer, lighter acidity. and the Mourvedre adds like a density with more heavy fruit, very opulent. So the Viognier what it does is it ties those red grape varietals together, and that you said it was 1%,
2%,
2%.
Mm-hmm.
A very small amount, very much desired by the winemaker and the end result of what they're looking for. So it's I think that's so neat. I always admire that about the winemakers, how talented and how honed their skills are, and how that little percentage that they look for when they're tasting the end result, they achieve it with such a small amount.
Yeah. But whites can add, it can add that fruitness that they couldn't find in the reds.
Mm-hmm. Well, Viognier can bring out like a tropical flavor. Mm-hmm. It could even bring out a banana flavor. Michel Gassier makes a straight Viognier that is just like that. You taste notes of tropical tones, fruit, like citrus, papaya, pineapple. It's like a kind of a silky, satiny fruit taste. It's not heavy, it's not acidic, but it's just very neutral. It's very much like a tone that is inviting on the palate from beginning to end. It's a really delicious grape on its own. And I've had Michel Gassier's straight Viognier, and it's very delicious. So.
And I looked at his pictures. He looks like a winemaker. Mm-hmm. He calls himself a peasant winemaker. Oh. Is what he calls himself. He's being humble. He's that's my lineage, and that's what I am.
It's the generation he comes from.
I'm a peasant winemaker. Yeah.
He's a down to earth kind of guy.
Yeah.
Even though he's critically acclaimed and huge in all of France and around the world.
Yeah, so that's the Pundit 2016. Now, just so you guys know, I was looking through the internet, through like on wine.com and other wine sources, and the 2016 in a lot of places are not available. The 2017s are available, and sometimes Costco carries this like at $16 or $17.
And then we paired this with a dinner that my parents actually made. Mm-hmm. They made an authentic dish of chile relleno.
Yes.
With a rice recipe from one of my aunts who's from Portugal. The rice has saffron, olive oil, capers. Yeah, it's a very soft, kind of floral hints to it, but on the palate, it's a little bit. It's like creamy in texture. I don't know if you remember what it tastes like, but it's like kind of a balancing of flavor on the palate, because the chile relleno is not hot, but it has a bit of spice to it, because my dad made this sauce that he always has to have his sauces, and they're very good, but they can be very hot because his sauces are authentic, his recipes, and he has to tone them way down when I come over, because I can't take heat. It was a beautiful sauce. He roasted the peppers on his grill on his stovetop, and so it's basically charred, and then he blends it, and so he gets this nice texture from the blender, and then he pours it over the chile relleno as he serves you, because you have to eat it right when he plates it and serves it to you. I think the heat of the sauce, but then the creaminess of the cheese that he stuffed the chile relleno with, and then the rice making the heat calm down from the sauce, it just all blended well together with the Pundit, because the Pundit naturally has the flavors of spice, like I tasted bell peppers and almost like a roasted bell pepper with some black pepper, and I felt like it was picking up those tastes from the food, but then at the same time, it was, even though they're on the same, you would say they compare, they're not contrasting. Mm-hmm. They moved really nice on the palate. So it wasn't like you were getting all this like hot, fiery heat or spice, because of the neutral food that was also now like the rice and the cheese. So it balanced out all the spices really nice. So that's what we paired it with. I think it went really well.
It did, yeah.
We didn't pick the menu. We showed up with the Pundit, and they happened to be making that. Sometimes my mom will collaborate with me and tell me what she's making, and then we'll pair the wine and bring it ahead of time. But you picked that out, as you had got it and just told her, if we were having meat or something. She said, no, it's not going to be a meat dish, but it's going to be savory.
Mm-hmm.
So we picked a Syrah because we love Syrahs, and we just felt like it would go with whatever they were making, and it did. So
it did.
Happened to work out really nice.
Yeah. I don't have it on that. I do know that your brother loved it. I mean,
yeah.
It's getting to the point when we go over there that we gotta bring like 3 bottles of wine now because
it's either that or we move to Magnums, which I don't think are enough. We could go to Jeroboam.
No.
So, that's like a double Magnum. So I think I'm going to start doing that to be funny. Like, here's your wine, family.
Here's your wine.
Because this is not enough.
Sir John, this one's for you.
The bottle's not enough for you. So, and we eat like with very like formal at my parents. So we have like appetizers, and we have the dish, and then we have dessert and coffee. So when we bring over wine, we've gotten accustomed to starting off with like an aperitif. We usually start off with a white wine, whether it be a still wine or sparkling, and then we move into reds. And we usually have to bring at least 2 bottles of reds now, which we're failing to do sometimes.
Yeah, no. But I like to start off with like a Vouvray or something.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to talk about a little bit about the history of Washington as a whole and AVA. I mean, we are specifically talking about Columbia Valley, Washington, AVA, because that's where the Pundit is from, the Tenant Winery. Basically, the Syrah that's grown there, or called Shiraz, same grape, they again do so well because of the soils. I wanted to talk about the Washington basaltic slopes, which we've covered before, I think, in one of our Washington, when we were talking about, maybe it was Walla Walla when we did the Otis Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
But just really brief, I don't want to go too much into it because it would be a lot of information. But basically, it's the smallest and youngest, best preserved continental flood basalt province on the earth, and it covers about 81,000 square miles. So this was formed by the Cascade Mountain Range, which created a rain shadow, which you've talked about in our other episodes. Yeah. So what that means is that the area throughout the entire year hardly gets any rain. Because of this, it created a varied microclimate through the AVA of Washington. So what this means is that they experience very extreme winters. They have a common risk in the winter and spring of frost. So the grapes can get frost. And that's because, again, it's so extreme with the winters. And then it goes into a very extensive, hot, dry summer. So within the flood basalt, there are many layers that distinguish both physical characteristics and chemical composition. And so the Columbia River is one of the bodies of water that is through the basalt province here in Washington, and it comprises more than 300 individual basalt lava layers. So that contributes to the type of soil that is similar to the terroir of Rhone Valley, or the Côte de Rhone. And I wanted to bring out also that when you're dealing with a red grape varietal such as Syrah, and it is a younger wine, like we had touched on earlier, one of the raters, Jeff Dunnick, brought out how it's drinkable now, but you could certainly age it for 5 to 6 years. So when you're tasting the wine, when they're saying drink it now, that means it's approachable. So when a wine is approachable, you sometimes with a younger wine you would taste it and you would get the factor, okay, I would pair this with a wine, or a food, because the acidity is a little bit more sharp. So with the sharpness of acidity, there's certain acids that are creating that taste, and it can be malic acid, which is not traditional to a wine varietal that is heavier or denser, but malic acid is sometimes added to a wine. And so what happens is if you let it age, then the alcohol meets the acid, and that's so those phenolic compounds come together, which are like tannins and pigments, and they tend to what's called polymerize, and this means that as they combine together, they make a longer molecule chain. So if you're visualizing it, the chain is short. If you're visualizing a picture of a molecule chain, and as time goes on, it gets longer, and what happens is it becomes heavy. So it can't stay suspended in the liquid when it becomes a longer molecule chain. And if you've ever swirled an aged wine glass, like a red wine glass, and you're drinking it, and you notice little sediments on the sides of the glass, that's what that is it's the fact that those the molecule chain, the longer molecule chain has broken down because it can't stay suspended, so it turns into a solid, and so basically drops out of being suspended, and then you get those little sediment factors that are in your glass. And so what that does is even though the acids remain this constant, even when the wine is aging, the perception on your palate changes, even though the acids are constant throughout, even through aging. And that's due to esters that are formed through aging. So that has to do again with all the science behind it that's happening. Those are things that I like to study and bring out and kind of go over in my mind, because it helps me understand. Just like when you're cooking is a science. When you're cooking on a stovetop, you're boiling water, or you're frying something or sauteing something. That's all science that's happening with the food. You're changing the chemicals, the natural occurring chemicals are changing the state, the form as it cooks. Similarly to a wine, drinking it now again, like and letting it age, you're changing the tone, even though the basis is still the same. You do taste like a heavier note, viscosity, because sugars are developing as they age, they're getting heavier. So the density or what's perceived on the palate changes to your taste, even though again, the elements within are the same. I wanted to go over like the varietals that are dominant to the Columbia Valley AVA. You have, for your reds, you have Cabernet Sauvignon, you have Merlot, you have Syrah, Cabernet Franc. So those are the 4 red varietals that are grown in the Columbia Valley, but Cabernet being the dominant one. And then the most planted white varietals there are Chardonnay and Riesling. From the cooler areas with the flavors of the whites, you get more like green apple and citrus. And then the vineyards that are planted in warmer areas, so more south-facing slopes, become more fleshier, you would call it. You get notes more of like stone fruit, so like the flesh of a peach, nectarine, apricot. So it changes because the sweetness level changes. You get from the cooler vineyards a more crisp, a more acidic, vibrant, kind of like a zestier sharpness of acid. And then they soften, become heavier and more ripened fruit taste from the southern slope end. So those are the differences in the climate, creating those different tones in the white varietals they grow there. The main white varietals that they grow there are, there's Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Gris, Sauvignon Blanc, and Gewürztraminer. And so those are the 5 white varietals that are grown there.
Gewürztraminer.
I like you've had it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
The background of Syrah, again, we touched on it earlier. The Syrah is native to northern Rhone, where its full potential and character flourishes because the vineyards are concentrated in the low-grade steppe of a village called Hermitage. And then if you go to the southern Rhone, which you covered some of the grapes or the wines that Michel Gassier has there, and southern Rhone, Syrah is added to blends, the GSM blends that originate there, so Grenache, Syrah, Vaudreuil, which make it more complex and deep and give it a deep, lush color. So they're used for different purposes, one on the north side, one on the south side. And Syrah is also widely planted in Australia. and is a key grape varietal in California and the Washington AVAs. I wanted to bring out that in 1966, Grenache was one of the first Vitis vinifera that was successfully vinified in Yakima Valley, and they made a rosé. And wines, or the wine grapes, were not the only fruit that was planted there first. There were, who can guess the other one? It's apples. So we all know that the really tasty apples come from Washington. Yeah. So those were the very first fruits cultivated in the Pacific Northwest initially in 1979, or actually in 1827. Sorry, I was getting my years mixed up. The early first pioneer settlers adored both of them, but what happened is the apples became very successful fast because they were very lucrative. And the grapes didn't take off because they weren't lucrative like the apples. And the grapes actually had a rockier start. So they had a bit of a labyrinth maze that they went through before the grapes became successful. So only in recent decades has the art and science of viticulture and enology reached groundbreaking achievement globally from Washington. So Washington currently has 750 plus active wineries to the local wine trade, with 350 growers, and more than 14,000 jobs have been made available because of the wineries, which currently contributes to an estimated $3 billion to the state's annual economy. So it's pretty huge.
It is pretty big.
Washington ranks second to California as the largest wine production in the U.S. So it's shipped to 50 states, all within the U.S., Washington wines, and then 40 other countries that Washington ships to outside of the U.S. So I would say that their grape juice has gotten around. So it took a bit longer, but it definitely reached success. And just to wrap it up, I found that because of the size of Washington, the AVA being so large and vast, that there's 13 AVAs that are within the Washington AVA. So you have Yakima Valley and Walla Walla Valley, which are two large areas that are popular, that are sections of Columbia Valley. And then they go into Puget Sound is another AVA, then Red Mountain, Columbia Gorge, Horse Heaven Hills, Wahluke Slope, Rattlesnake Hills, Snipes Mountain, Lake Chelan, and I believe it's Natchez Heights, which is one of the newer AVAs. It's actually became an AVA in January of 2012. So pretty new. The Ancient Lakes of Columbia Valley would be the 13th AVA. And key facts about Washington, that it's so large, it's so vast, and there's so much happening over there, and there's much opportunity in the wine industry. One of the key factors that I found was pretty amazing is that a new winery opens up every 15 days in Washington.
Oh my God.
It's like, that's a fact. And Washington has 50,000 acres planted with wine grapes. And again, I just mentioned second to California. Washington is the second largest producer of fine wines in the world. Mm-hmm. And vineyards are, again, the key factor for its success because of the terroir and the climate, the varied microclimate that it has. It's because of the south-facing slopes, which increases sun exposure and promotes circulation in winter. So very key factor to the success of their grape growing production. And that's all I have.
That's all you have.
Washington.
Washington.
Yes, there's a lot more, but I figured, that's enough for today.
Yeah, it was a lot. No, but it's good information, though. It really is. Like, you never realize. I think there's 11 million acres that is inside of the Columbia Valley AVA, and it runs down to Oregon, but only 50,000 acres are planted.
Yeah, I was going to say, because part of it goes into Oregon.
Yeah.
Because it's so large.
Yeah, it's a big area. And I think that this area, too, is part of that Calderas ice shelf. ran through there that came down from Canada.
Again, we'll probably have a second part to this.
Yeah.
You wanted to cover the two people that you were bringing out earlier.
Yeah, I
and then
really
we can
want to
bring
go
out
into
those points.
Andre Chaleshev, because his history is just it's ridiculous how much his history, like he fought in the Russian Revolution, and he was in the White Army. His whole platoon got gunned down, and
Oh my gosh.
he was left for dead.
Survived.
There's so many things about him and he survived, and then he decides, I'm going to move. You know, I don't blame him. Andre's my new hero. Yes. My Russian hero. All right. But this was, so this is the pundit. What we tried was a 2016. Again, if you can find it, that's great. If not, your 2017s and 18s are still probably not the same exact flavor as now, but their ratings are still really high. And if I come across it, I'll probably grab a couple and see how those taste. But I'm sure they're fine. I don't think they'd keep on
They're always going to be a little
releasing
slightly different on the percentage of the blend. So
Yeah.
if you get a younger wine, it's not going to be as dense and full. It's going to be a little bit lighter, a little bit thinner. And so it just depends on the year. But I mean, if you want to buy a bottle or two, buy a case, drink a little bit now, and
Save it for
age
a
some.
year, yeah. Save it for a year or two.
Definitely.
Or 6.
If you have some patience.
Yeah.
We highly recommend the pundit, guys. So if you want to ask us about any food pairings, visit our website. You can ask us questions, leave some thoughts. You know, whatever is on your mind, we'd love to address that for you.
Yeah, speaking of that, we put a new website up. I've been working on it for, I want to say a long time, but it's been a long time.
You're so quick at that, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, but we actually have a contact section now, like before we didn't have it, so now we do. If you guys have any questions or want us to include anything, or if you have information that you think we should go over and that you would find interesting, you know, just let us know. If you hate it, let us know. At least you're listening. You know. So yeah, this is again the pundit made by Attendant Wines in 2016.
Where Rhone meets Washington, Columbia Valley.
Where Rhone meets
Good
Washington.
stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent. All right, so this is Wine from On the Vine to the Road Tasted, and thanks for whoever's listening, and we will see you guys later.
Hey, have a good one, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.